Hello everybody. We just got about 5 minutes before we start the webinar officially, so welcome, and yeah, hold tight. We'll speak to you very soon. Okay, well, it's our official starting time now, so welcome you all to the webinar that we're holding today on the BRCGS different certification options that have come about. My name is Todd Redwood. I'm the Global Food and Retail Supply Chain Operations and Compliance Director. I'm based in Sydney in Australia, and so it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. Logistically today on the webinar, your microphones have all been muted just so that we prevent any interference coming through. And we're going to do about 35 to 40 minutes of presentation and then allow some time for questions. And there's a chat function that you can use to ask questions. So rather than verbally ask the questions, you can write those questions through, and then a moderator will ask me those questions at the end of the session. We'll try and get through as many questions as possible, hopefully all of them, if we have the time. And also after the webinar, we're going to send out a recorded session of what we've shared, as well as a couple of documents which will help you with the concept of remote auditing. So I think it's without further ado, I'll get on with the show. So through the webinar today, we're going to talk about what the food sector's position has been on remote auditing, and I'll base this around the pandemic itself, from the beginning through to where we are now. I'll then talk about the various different BRCGS options that have been made available to certified sites around the world. Talk about some of the benefits as well as the challenges of remote auditing, and then talk about some tips to help with remote audits, as well as some of the technology used for remote audits. And then, of course, as I mentioned, some questions, or allow some time for questions and answers. So the food sector itself has been a little bit slow off the mark in some respects to respond to the pandemic with respect to remote auditing. Many other sectors around the world responded quite quickly, and so remote audits were instigated early on, and a lot of remote auditing has been done since early this year. But the food sector was quite reluctant to take on board the remote audit concept, and that was mainly driven by the GFSI position, so the Global Food Safety Initiative position, that early in the pandemic, they said there would be no remote audits, and that they basically only endorsed the extension of certificates by up to 6 months. Later on, by about the middle of the year, the GFSI came out with an option where it was a partial remote audit, and we'll talk about the partial remote audit that BRCGS offers. And then many of the retailers and brands followed the GFSI position, so they were also reluctant to accept remote auditing. Some regulators, we said, that we saw were accepting, others not. Anyway, 6 months later and down the track, or more than 6 months now, there's a realization that remote audits are necessary. We're not having the access to sites to be able to inspect and audit effectively through documentation only. So various remote audit options have become available, and we're going to talk today about the BRCGS options. So the first one that BRCGS came out with was in line with the GFSI position to be able to extend certificates. The second one is about a blended audit, which is a half remote, half on-site audit. And then, of course, the full remote audits, which have been most recently released. So from a certificate extension perspective, these are applicable to sites that are operational only and where there's no possible physical access for an auditor to attend. It could be through various different means. It could be because the site doesn't allow access because there's no travel into the country, or within that region of the country. But it has to be through no physical access availability. The current certificate can be extended for the current scope by up to 6 months, but for BRCGS, it's not applicable for sites with a C or D grade certificate. So if there were a lower grading certificate, then a certificate extension is not possible. The first part of the certificate extension is a risk assessment to determine whether that certificate is impacted by COVID and various other aspects. And then there's a discussion held with the site which talks about their emergency response plan to COVID-19, the internal audit response or results that they've had, any recent customer complaints, as well as any product recalls that they may have had in the interim before or between the last audit and this particular certificate extension taking place. If the discussion with the site reveals any doubts or concerns about the validity of or the action taken by the site, there are concerns raised. They're not non-conformances, but they're managed in the same way that a non-conformance would be managed through the BRCGS process normally. Sorry. The standards, the BRCGS standards that a certificate extension can be applied to are the packaging and packing materials, the storage and distribution standard, the food safety, agents and brokers, and gluten-free certification program. So those 5 you can apply a certificate extension to. The second option that BRCGS had available is the blended audit. This is one that's endorsed by GFSI. It's a 2-part announced audit, and the first part is an off-site remote assessment, which is then followed within 28 days with an on-site visit. It is possible to get a concession for up to 90 days after the off-site remote assessment to be able to then conduct the on-site audit. However, in some cases, it's not possible to get back to the site within 28 to 90 days. And in this case, that certificate becomes invalid. It ceases to remain. This blended option is available for recertification audits only. And it's not dependent on the grade of the certificate. So from A through to D, they're all eligible for a blended audit option. However, you can't do an initial or a new certification using the blended audit approach. The first stage is a risk assessment to determine the impact on the site, and then moving into a planning phase, taking into consideration information security and also connectivity testing prior to the blended audit commencing. The duration for blended audits is the same It's just divided into two parts. The time is based on, when I say it's the same as the duration calculation for any on-site audit would normally be. You know, outside of the COVID period, you would have, if it was a 12-hour audit or a 16-hour audit, that would be the duration. It would then be broken into two parts. No more than 50% of that duration, though, can be done remotely. So generally, there'll be a larger proportion done on-site in the blended audit. And the time for planning, the risk assessment and reporting is not included within the usual audit time. So that is additional time. You can apply the blended audit approach to head office audits or centralized function audits. So there are applicabilities in that area as well. So the first part of the blended audit is doing the remote. This may include some live video feed from the site, but it doesn't have to. The on-site audit, though, has to include a minimum of these three elements. So there's the inspection of good manufacturing practice, there's the implementation of the HACCP methodology, and also the traceability challenge. Those three elements have to be conducted on-site. So we need to make sure that there's enough time to be able to do those. Of course, other elements can be completed on-site as well, but they're the bare minimum ones. The usual audit protocols apply to the remote portion as well as the on-site portion of the audit. So it's like a normal audit, it's just done in two parts with some different methodologies to do that. Non-conformances are submitted in exactly the same way that they normally would be within 28 days of the on-site audit taking place, so the final day of the audit. And the report will include a mention of a blended announced audit within the report. So it has to be just so that the recipient of the report understands that it was a blended audit approach. The grading of these audits follows the usual BRCGS protocols. So based on the number of non-conformities, the protocol will come up with the grade at the end. And then the resultant certificate will mention blended announced audit on the certificate so that it's apparent to those receiving that certificate that it was done in a blended half remote, half on-site fashion. We can apply the blended audit approach to these standards. So it's the same 5 standards: packing materials, storage and distribution, the food safety, agents and brokers, and also the gluten-free certification program. But in addition to those, we can also include the additional voluntary modules of Module 11, which is Meat Supply Chain Assurance, as well as the FSMA Preparedness Module 13. The third option that BRCGS presents to us is the full remote audit. This one has only come out in the last month or so. It's been released. And it's an announced audit which covers every aspect of whichever relevant standard we're talking about. What's important to understand about the full remote audit option is that whilst it's accredited and it follows the full BRCGS relevant standard, it's not GFSI recognised. So GFSI don't actually recognise or endorse this particular methodology of full remote. We can apply the full remote audit option to new certifications. So unlike the blended where we couldn't do new, in the full remote we can do new certifications. We can also do transfer certifications where a certificate moves from one certification body to another. It applies to expired certificates in 2020. So any certificate that's expired for any reason in 2020, the year 2020, is eligible for a full remote audit. Any certificate extensions that are about to expire or that have expired are also included into this option. If we have a blended audit where part 2, the on-site part, can't be delivered, then we can apply the full remote audit option in place of going on site and continue the life of that certificate. And of course, we can also do an extension to scope or an amendment to the certificate through the full remote audit option. Again, the usual audit protocols apply to this option. So it's like a normal BRC audit. It just happens to be done fully remotely, fully virtually. The process for the full remote audit, in brief, is that we conduct a feasibility assessment first. The feasibility assessment addresses whether or not it's possible to conduct a full remote audit using an assessment of the technology and the availability of people within the site to be able to host that audit, as well as the connection from the auditor end. It's then followed by an information submission and a review by the auditor of that information that's submitted by the site. There's quite a lot of planning goes into the remote audit, and quite a lot of connectivity testing as well prior to the audit. It's very important that prior to a remote audit that all the technology is I guess revealed and tested to its fullest to ensure that on the day of the audit or the days of the audit that the technology performs as it should. The audit includes all aspects of the relevant standard, and there's a full visual site inspection done remotely as well. So the auditor has to be taken on a tour throughout the entire site, inside and outside, to demonstrate to them what they would normally see if they were doing an on-site audit. Non-conformances are managed in the same way that BRCGS normally would. So within 28 days of the final day of the audit, the non-conformances need to be submitted, and the report will include remote audit option within the report as well. The grading follows the usual protocols, as was the case in the blended audit approach, and the certificates, whilst being accredited, will include remote audit option on the certificate as an audit type. The normal audit cycles apply to this remote audit option, so the following audit would follow in the usual fashion unless an earlier expiry date is required or requested by the site. So the site may request to bring their next audit in 2021, or the one after this full remote audit is conducted. They may request to bring that forward to align with some other event or some seasonality of their product, and that's all legitimate. So an audit can always move forward. It just can't extend beyond its usual expiry date. We can do full remote audits for the packaging materials standard, for storage and distribution, for food safety and gluten-free certification program. You'll notice that the agents and brokers standard is not mentioned in this one, and that's because agents and brokers can actually be done fully remote in the blended audit option as it was, because you don't need to go on site for the agents and brokers for the blended audit approach. So it's already covered there. All additional voluntary modules for BRCGS can be applied to the full remote audit option, with the exception at the moment of the ASDA AA module. BRCGS were active in seeking the support from stakeholders around the world for their full remote audit option. And these are an example of some of the stakeholders that they worked with to be able to gain that support. So you can see that there's some big names there based in many parts of the world who are supportive of this option. And so whilst we recognise that the full remote audit option is not GFSI recognised, many of these stakeholders, or these stakeholders that we can see here as well as others, support the notion that the remote audit is still satisfactory for their needs. So now, leaving behind the details of the BRCGS options, we're going to just talk now about the benefits as well as the challenges of remote auditing itself, the practice. There's definitely some benefits, and some of those benefits include maintaining the audit cycles and managing the risk that's apparent within our food sector, our food industry. By extending certificates through documentary evidence, it doesn't give the industry a lot of satisfaction. It doesn't give them a lot of confidence that food safety is being managed well. By remote auditing, we're adding in an element of that visual and the tour of the facility, and we're getting a much more full picture of what's going on. Sorry about that. I'm not sure why that's happening. It certainly helps to encourage food safety culture within the site. The fact that there's an external body coming in with some degree of regularity to perform the food safety audits, and therefore food safety culture keeps on track better. We've got access as a certification body now to a greater network of global expert auditors, because we don't have the country divides and the time zones and travel required to be able to present experts in this remote fashion. So we are using auditors from different parts of the world to perform audits in parts of the world that they would not normally or necessarily go to in their normal course of work. There's definitely an environmental benefit. The decrease in the carbon footprint and the expense of travel has been reduced dramatically through remote auditing. It also, again, it gives much more flexibility for both parties, the auditor and the auditee, in the way that this is delivered. It can be done sometimes in multiple days, in half days. You know, there's lots of different ways that we can cut this pie up. So it's definitely a much more flexible option. And it also engages, or gives the opportunity to engage more people within an organisation being audited, regardless of where they're based. In the past, they normally have to be there in physical and present, and now we're able to join many more people together, interested parties, in a much more flexible way. So it's very good. And talking about, you know, the benefits and being able to access this option, you know, BSI is very expert in the remote audits. It's not new to us, so BSI started to work on remote auditing about 5 years ago. So it wasn't the pandemic that threw us into this position. We are actually well prepared for the position that the pandemic put us in, and we've been able to deploy more than 60,000 days of remote audit since the beginning of the pandemic. So not in the food sector alone, across all the sectors that we cover, but it's quite a remarkable feat, considering that you know, most audits were actually conducted on site physically up until February or March this year, and since then we've been able to achieve such a great number of remote audits. There are definitely some challenges though. This is no silver bullet. It's not meant to be necessarily to replace physical on-site auditing forever, although I can say that I would suggest that we're going to see a lot more remote auditing into the future, even post-pandemic. So one of the challenges is that it is less personal, and there's less interaction because you don't necessarily get to know the people as well. Having said that, I must say I've met through remote auditing a lot of people that I would never have met. So you know, it also encourages interaction as well. There's some time management challenges because time can get away from the parties involved in the audit. So it's important to make a plan and keep to the plan. Paper-based documentation, which some companies still use, can be quite difficult to share. It's not particularly efficient. It requires a lot of pre-scanning and for that sharing, so that can make it tricky. Electronic records and documentation are a lot easier to share. There's always the possibility for a technology failure. We don't see a lot of it. In fact, you know, within the amount of remote auditing that we've been doing, we've had very little failure, but it's possible. So that can let the site down from time to time. It is possible also that access to certain areas of a facility can be compromised physically or through connectivity issues. So that can be a bit of a problem. It can be challenging to read the body language of both the auditee and the auditor in this environment, and sometimes you don't pick up on the nuances of what's going on in the room from an auditor point of view, which can also lead to the last point of the tendency to push through and not have breaks. So the auditor might not realise that the room full of people really need a break, and they're just intently beavering away and getting their audit done. So to the point of these challenges, we also have some tips. Planning is essential, and a lot of planning goes into these remote audits. Much more planning, in fact, to a remote audit than a usual or regular on-site audit. It's then important to follow that plan and very carefully, and if there are changes to the plan, to communicate them to all parties so that everyone understands what's going on and when. We ensure that regular breaks are put into the plan, they're scheduled in, and that they're taken, and that helps people just stay fresh and be able to continue on and effectively and efficiently conduct the audit. It's good if the list of documents and records are shared up front to the auditee, so that then there's an understanding of the expectation, and we don't receive delays or don't slow the audit down for looking for records and documents that could have been easily prepared beforehand. It's then therefore important to make sure that there is an ease of access to the records that are required. And in some cases, and not all, and it's not compulsory, but it certainly helps. In some cases, our clients, the sites that we're auditing, are prepared to share their audit documentation or some of the high level stuff, the hazard plans, site maps, this kind of stuff, so that the auditor can become more familiar with the site and the process prior, and then it helps the audit flow much better. We maintain the usual audit protocols for remote audit, so it's all the same process and behaviours that are expected of an auditor and an auditee for that matter. It's important that the auditee does have the information ready so as not to create those delays that we mentioned before. And it can be also quite useful to have a quiet environment prepared for conducting the remote audit on the site end, so that it's easier for conducting interviews, for sharing. Noise can become an issue or other distractions in the audit. So if it is possible to have a place dedicated to conduct the remote audit from on site, it's sort of most beneficial. Other tips related to technology: we need to consider which technology is going to be used and then test it well in advance of the audit. It's no point in getting to the day of the audit and realizing that the technology has failed. It's a waste of everyone's time. So a short amount of connectivity testing and technology testing prior helps to ensure a smooth audit. The Wi-Fi signal strength for video I'm talking about here needs to be strong enough to support that video in production areas, in storage areas, and other areas of the site that the auditor will need to tour to be able to see the full gamut of what's going on in that particular certified site. It's important to consider authorization to take mobile technology into production areas. Usually it's quite a protected environment, and so glass and electronics can sometimes be forbidden from taking into those environments. There may be the ability to work around those and risk assess those rules to be able to allow this to go ahead. Some environments have got highly explosive environments through dust and those sort of things, so electronics may not be able to take it into those as well. We do have some options that we have available to us which allow us to take electronics into highly explosive areas or difficult areas like that. Some of our mobile remote technology we can deploy for that. And we have to consider access for multiple parties that are going to be engaged in the audit. So does the platform allow for enough people to be able to participate for the duration of the audit? It's important to consider the use of noise cancelling technology, and so maybe headphones or headsets to take into the production environments, so that the auditor on the other end can actually hear the tour guide taking them through, and can hear people when they need to perform interviews with workers and those sort of cases. In the event that testing fails prior to a remote audit, the audit can't proceed. Failure, I would not necessarily stop at the first time that you didn't succeed, and we have had some cases where the remote audits that we've been performing in the food sector have had some challenges, and we've gone back and tried again, and in some cases tried a third time, and on the third time the site has prepared in a different way. They've put boosters in, or they've relocated their routers and Wi-Fi equipment, and it's enabled the audit to go ahead. In the event that there's a technology failure during the remote audit, we need to reschedule it and work out how to do it in the same fashion that I talked about, try and try again if a test failed. During the site tour, using the remote technology, we can use a lot of different types of technology to give the auditor a view of the production environment and other areas of the site. We can use fixed video cameras that may be in play, and that could give them a view of certain areas in combination with maybe mobile phone or tablet video technology. Photography can be used, so you could send a photograph through to an auditor to be able to enable them to see some of the detail that they may have been not able to see through video. And we do also have some wearable video camera technology available to us, so helmets and glasses style technology that can be worn by a user on the auditee end and give the auditor a very full and thorough view or tour of the site. So that takes us through to our question time now. So I'll bring myself back on so you can see me, and yeah, ask if anyone had any questions that have come through in the chat.
We have indeed, Todd. Can you hear me all right?
I can, thank you, Cara.
Excellent. The first question focuses on how our auditors have been trained to do this remote auditing process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very important point and good question. Thank you. All of our auditors have been trained, so we have a standardized training module for remote auditing for all of our auditors across the globe, and that's been put in place. It is essential. So for BRCGS audits, it's part of the requirement that the certification body has trained its auditors, and that's something that we have done through our own experience and practice.
Excellent. And also, will remote audits take any longer than on-site audits?
We don't see much evidence at the moment. There could be occasion where it may, and that could be just an unusual case. But generally speaking, we're actually seeing the remote audits taking the same time as the audit would normally take. Sometimes they actually take a little bit less time, and we have to be careful of that because audit duration is something that we need to adhere to. But because some of the social chit-chat is removed from the audit through the remote process at times, it can actually make the audit a little faster than you would usually expect. But we tend not to see durations going any longer.
Excellent. A somewhat similar question, but do remote audits cost any more or any less for the client?
No, well, our charges, our rates that we charge are the same. So whether the auditor was on site or remote, we charge the same. So therefore, based on duration, you know, there should be no reason that the audit would be any more expensive. I guess there are reasons that the audit may end up being slightly less expensive as a result of no travel associated with that audit in some cases where travel used to be involved.
Okay, and sorry, I should have grouped this one up previous. I've just been compiling a list as they've come through, but it's sort of back to that sort of time question. And do the factory tours tend to take any more time? Is there a different balance in where things are focused during a remote audit?
Well, in BRCGS, they have actually acknowledged that a factory tour may take less time remotely than it would on site. And so they do allow for a reduction. Normally, they expect 50% of the audit duration to be spent within the factory or the production environment. It could take less time just because of the efficiency of taking someone around with a camera versus them walking around themselves. But if that tour is done effectively and properly, well, it should take around the same time.
Okay, great. Has there been any indication that BRCGS is going to adjust their certification fees because of remote auditing, either up or down?
No, the fees that they usually charge are fixed. There's only one anomaly to that, and that's a certificate extension is half the price of the usual certificate fee. So it's £287.50 as opposed to the full £575 for the other standards.
Okay, great. And what is the implication of a certificate not being recognized by GFSI?
Well, it's a very individual question, and of course the answer is going to apply differently in many different settings. But we've tested the market as well. We've spoken to many of the stakeholders around the world, and the general consensus is that people believe that an audit that's conducted is better than one that's not. And GFSI, if you consider that the BRC standards have been written to the full GFSI benchmark, and when you're adhering to the full standard, you're therefore following all the GFSI elements from the benchmark. The only thing that's different is the fact that it's conducted remotely, which is something that GFSI doesn't support. So from that perspective, I think there's a pragmatic view in most cases to say, we understand, you know, we obviously prefer it to be GFSI, but in the event that it can't be, we prefer to have an accredited BRCGS certificate.
Excellent. And a follow-on to that actually is, do you think remote auditing will be used after the pandemic for food safety standards?
Yeah. I mentioned that during the session there briefly, and so to expand on that, yes, I do. I think that we'd be fools to think that the remote auditing is not going to become a permanent fixture in some way in our future. I don't think it's going to fully replace on-site physical face-to-face auditing, but I think it may become a supplementary tool. We might see different cycles done remotely. We might see different locations done in sampling, in some schemes where sampling takes place. So I don't believe that we'll see the end of remote auditing when we see the end of the pandemic.
Fair enough. One final question that's come in. What happens if a site opts for a blended audit, but then there is no site access available after the 28-day limit to have that follow on?
So there is the possibility to get a concession through your certification body. So I assume through BSI. And we then go to BRCGS and seek the concession to be able to extend it from 28 days to 90 days. However, there is a possibility to then not go to 90 days, but divert straight into a full remote audit, or go to the 90 days, and if site access is not available, then to engage a full remote audit. So the full remote audit option is used to pick up a blended audit that can't be completed for part 2 as well.
Excellent, thanks very much. Those are the questions from the field.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, we will be sending out some information to you all as participants following the webinar. There's also up on the screen now the website address to go to. There's always information on there about our food sector programs, as well as some information about remote auditing. And there's also an email address there that you can use to email if you've got any queries or questions about what we've talked about today, or anything else that we do in BSI. So I'd like to thank you very much for attending. Thanks for your attention, and wish you well, stay safe, and keep well. Thank you very much.